Thanks, Greg. Again, I'm not Peggy Hall, and she would really appreciate me saying that I'm not Peggy Hall because she's often warns county educators, don't be given lawyer answers when you're not a lawyer. That's kind of a big deal in the realm of being an attorney, is to not give legal advice when you're not a licensed lawyer. It'd be kind of like practicing medicine or veterinary medicine and giving out those kind of recommendations or doing procedures. So again, the asterisk on today's presentation is Peggy Hall is not here. We're filling in just temporarily to give you some resources related to ag law at Ohio State University. If you choose to stand up and walk out because there might be a more interesting session, that is perfectly okay. There is an 8 o'clock session occurring at the chapel on entomology that Curtis Young is teaching that starts right here at the same time. And then again at 8:30 in room A, there's another presentation as well. So Gary and I talked this morning just a little bit about maybe having a conversation about what issues are important to all of you or what's going on in your realm, in your world, and then relate that back to what we use maybe as resource folks in agriculture. What do we lean on? If I can't get a hold of Peggy Hall, where do I go to find some legal information and to know the status of what things are happening? Okay, so the first place to start, Gary, let me ask you just kind of an impromptu question. What are some of the ag law issues that you hear based on the associations that you're involved with, whether they're livestock associations or crops? What's kind of the front burner of ag law in your perspective?
Well, everybody always has questions on liability. And so with that in mind, a lot of farms and organizations are looking at LLCs and trying to have various kinds of partnerships and incorporating in various kinds of ways. You do need to work through your accountant. You need to have an attorney work through that. And even though all of us know many farms and operations that have gone that direction, that's not necessarily saying that's the best option for you. You need to look at all the factors. Many farms have employees today. There's certainly a lot of factors to deal with that. And one person that a lot of farms have these days, if it's not an attorney, it's an accountant. That's a very, very important part of the operation. And as everybody knows, there's always a lot of changes in that arena. And it's hard when you're, knee deep, elbow deep in all the activities of what you're trying to do, standing back and look at the total picture and see what things are best to do from a financial management point of view and a legal point of view. But liability is always a big one, Bruce.
Sure. And so once we get into some topics, and I think we'll start with this website, and I hope that you'll be familiar with this after the session. There's a great website that Ohio State maintains. It is called Farm Office. The Farm Office has a simple website. I think you can remember, farmoffice.osu.edu. And it's going to be the landing place for several of the farm management type of related programs, but one of which, related to Peggy Hall, would be her ag law library, which is what we are logged into today, and then there are tabs across the top. The ag law library then is designed to be that filing drawer that you may pull open, and in there are several different topics that she has prepared, what she has called ag bulletins on. And the topics just listed on this screen are everything from animal law to fence line laws, nuisance laws, Ohio oil and gas laws, all of these current issues that you may be wondering about and want to do some reading and some background information, maybe before you engage into a conversation, either with a landowner, a neighbor, or even an attorney. You may want to do some self-education on these topics first. A question that I get as a county educator every so often is, can you help me find an attorney that knows something about ag law? Show of hands, how many of you actually in your community back home know that attorney that has that ag law focus? I see a couple, 3, good. And if you know that ag law professional that has those resources and experiences, that is good. What Peggy Hall also does is that she, it's not a a peer-reviewed or maintained it's not a perfect list, but she engages both professionally and with education programs with attorneys around Ohio. And so she has maintained a list of ag attorneys that she has worked with, that they believe in the education component of what ag law can be to help folks, and that they are there to serve you from an educational standpoint first off, and then can actually make some of those tangible steps to get from wherever you are at point A and you want to get to point B. Sometimes we need attorneys along that way. And so back to this website, the Ag Law Library is an excellent place to start if you are looking for a topic. And so I'll click on one here called Farm Leasing Law Library. And then in Farm Leasing, there are several bulletins in here that are a starting point. For example, a couple weeks ago, I had a call from an area farmer that they were looking for a way to lease the current line of equipment to the next generation, to the junior generation. So the senior generation had all this equipment line up, and it wasn't feasible financially for the junior generation just to start paying the tab on all that equipment, let alone the land cost of that transition in the farm business. And so through Peggy's help and through this website and another resource called Ag Lease 101, which is a North Central region resource, we were able to have some reading material for the family to look at, but then also some example agreements that can help that family really accomplish what they want to do, with the caveat that if the two parties are getting into a legal agreement, that there should be a local attorney involved with that relationship. Even though Ohio State University or any other land-grant institution would provide you an example document, it is really still good to protect both parties by having some legal advisement on that document. So just some examples of resources that are in here. Gary, were there any other ones that are interesting to you on that list?
Everybody in here has had experiences on many of these, undoubtedly, and feel free to share some experiences, what you have learned. But all of these, depending on the situation, we all have neighbors. All those neighbors are not only getting closer and closer to us, but they're people that have no idea what you do. And they're probably afraid of what you do, and they may not trust what you do. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with them not knowing what life is in the country and et cetera. And probably a big one that I hear about often is livestock, spreading manure, and those kinds of things. In this day and age, with more and more of the manure being injected, I don't see the odor being a big problem like it used to be. We all remember when that odor was, but that's less the case. And unfortunately for the farmer, if the neighbors were smelling the odor, that means that you were losing nutrients. Because if you were smelling that manure, that nutrients was going up in the air as opposed to in your soil.
And one thing that Peggy often does, and again, for those that have come in, Peggy Hall is sick today, and so we're pinch hitting a little bit here on this topic for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to turn you loose just after some discussion here as we get to that point. But what Peggy often does in a presentation is that she shares with you these case studies. And we may have laws on the books, but then they're challenged or refined by having case studies that actually go through the court systems that help to refine and determine how a judge would come down in interpreting that law. And so a lot of times these websites will give you case studies on each of these topics that are very pertinent to Midwestern farms, Midwestern farm businesses related to these topics on ag law. And again, it's another type of resource that Peggy works very hard to accomplish with this ag law library. Another part of this website is not just the library where there are static topic readable fact sheets or law bulletins that are available for these topics. She also does an ag law blog, which you could subscribe to. And this ag law blog is designed to have a kind of a current reading material of current case studies that are available. So live from Ohio Department of Ag, it's hemp applications. So if you have questions about how hemp and Ohio law relates and what the steps are going to be, what the truths are when it comes to the law and the application process. There's a lot of talk about that industry developing in Ohio, but there is a backbone, a structure that is statutory that would define a lot of the questions that people have about hemp in Ohio. So these are just some examples of the Ag Law blog that you can go on to this website, again, farmoffice.osu.edu. Farm Office is one word as you type that into your browser. And then like a lot of websites with OSU, it's .osu.edu.
This is the site that I was actually looking up just a few minutes ago, and I want to point out to you a lot, this water quality session, we're going to talk throughout the day about water quality and several different issues, but certainly the legal side of what's going on in water quality is important. And Peggy does have a current article on what does a TDML mean in relationship to our watershed. So I would encourage you to go back and look for that particular piece. She also has done a lot with manure and regulations and looking at those, and I'd really encourage you to go back here and look for some of that current information. Probably any of you know LEBOR, LEBOR? Trying to forget what those initials stand for. Anybody know what the current status of that is? If you've been reading the press, basically LEBOR has been dismissed by the judge that was presiding over that case, and dismissed with a lot of, I don't know if the right term because I'm not legal, but prejudice towards that case. In other words, really slammed what was being attempted there. Not the ideal of having a better Lake Erie, but the legal process that was used there. In the legal world, I'm never sure if that means that it's over because that judge isn't the Supreme Court, and that's always where these things head next way. But from LEBOR's standpoint, at this point, it's been dismissed and is not really a valid thing to have to worry about. And I think that's been important because we've seen such a cooling of people's attitudes, particularly right after that of, well, do I want to be a part of a soil and water program because now I'm opening up my records just a little bit to somebody else? And are they going to come back on me? Do I want to participate with OSU Extension on some research plots and try and get better answers? And I think, I hope at least it gets us to the point that that cooling of wanting to participate in programs, I think we see that with H2O, but also participate in trying to find answers that by not having that maybe hanging over our head, that there's more interest and willingness and wanting to work with that particular area of trying to find solutions and answers. And that's where we'll be headed with the rest of this program a little bit later on, is looking at some of that research on water quality and impacts at edge of field. So just wanted to bring that up because there are several good things in there. I'm trying to understand what TMDL means now that we're headed towards that process, and more so from the standpoint of how actively we want to be involved, which I would encourage you to actively be involved in that, to try and have the discussion remain science-based, have this discussion be realistic, and not have the discussion be something that really doesn't make any sense from a common sense standpoint, because I think we bring that to the discussion from an agricultural perspective, is that common sense of, connecting the dots on what happens from an ag practice standpoint and what can be realistic to implement. So would just encourage you to follow that TMDL process as it starts up and participate wherever you get a chance, because the only way you'll have influence is being at the table. Being away from the table, we can sit and bitch and moan and complain, but it's not going to change anything.
Appreciate that, Greg. Let's, again, we recognize that Peggy Hall is sick today and she is not here. So if you're looking to say, why are these three guys up here and where's Peggy Hall? That's the case again. We're going to open it up a little bit just to hear from all of you, because often at CTC, the questions from the group or the comments from the group can be really learning within the group. So don't be bashful today. What kind of some of the issues that ag law related to where you're at or where your ag business is at that are pertinent to you? If Peggy were here today, what might you be asking about today?
Or what experiences have you had, your neighbors in your vicinity? I know when this Lebor thing all come around, a big rush in our area, especially Hancock County, was getting your farm signed up in an ag district, because that gives you an extra level of liability. And I know in our county, and I'm sure Defiance too, a lot of interest in that. And that's something that you have to renew every 5 years, and that's very, very important. It's not going to guarantee that you won't have anything bad happen to you, but it gives you another layer of liability and cushion.
Yeah, sure does. Yes, sir.
In case of a liability, is a LLC safer than a corporation?
Yeah, so the question I'm hearing is does an LLC protect like a corporation would protect? Mm-hmm. Yep, which is better? Boy, Peggy would be great at answering that. There's been a lot of interest in enrolling into LLCs, and whether it's for generational transitioning and parking certain assets of a farm operation into an LLC to protect it, whether that's because we would put our equipment or operational side of a farm into the LLC and giving that entity that protection. So there are resources on the website that talk about defining what those structures of an organization are. And that's a great comment, that at least knowing that we have options in Ohio to structure our farms. And I know of a farm in Defiance County that back in the 70s, it was the thing to be in a C corporation. And now they're wondering, is it a good idea now, or am I hampered by that decision that was made 30 plus years ago? And what's the consequences of us considering getting out of that? And that's where Peggy Hall and her resources and connecting to a lawyer that has that agricultural experience can help answer those questions, to see if that decision of 30 years ago, in fact, is still a good decision for that farm operation today. Yes, sir.
I want to get Greg help again on the TMDL.
TMDL.
Not state waters, it's international waters. So who will be dealing with TMDL? US EPA, since it is international law.
The question is about TMDL and how the process is going to happen, because we have two countries involved in Lake Erie in relationship to the quality of the waters there. I don't know the answer to that. My assumption, based off of everything that you see in the press, is that Ohio EPA is going to be the driver behind that, because they are the local jurisdiction to that kind of process here in the state. That's always been the discussion. The open waters versus the watershed and what goes on there are interconnected, but it's not very clear how direct that interconnection is when we talk about those jurisdictional types of things. But my assumption, and I think would be safe to go with, is that Ohio EPA will be the driver behind that, so you'll want to kind of keep track of what Ohio EPA is doing in relationship to that TMDL development. And I'm not sure who will be in charge of that. I mean, at some point there's going to be somebody that's going to be responsible for that process, and I'm not aware of any names or directions there. Anybody else heard who might be leading that effort? Yeah, go ahead.
Anytime you get the EPA involved, which they're going to be involved in this regardless, I think it's going to be imperative that we try to make sure that it stays within the state and Ohio EPA rather than go to the feds.
Oh yeah, and that's what happened in Chesapeake Bay. Was it went to a federal jurisdiction, and that led to a whole lot of problems that they had to resolve later on, and it was kind of a delay in getting the process to work towards the goals that were set. So that's going to be very important. I've got a question for the audience, and that is one of the things that we deal with in agriculture is the reality that somewhere around 50 to 60% of the land that you farm may not be under your ownership and direct control, particularly when we start talking about capital improvements and things of tiling or adding a drainage water management structure and some of those kind of things to the end of the tile. And I'll use another couple of examples. One thing that we often see in leases, or sometimes see in leases, that you have to provide the bill that you provided or did a crop removal rate of nutrient for P&K in that lease agreement, regardless of whether the soil test level is at 150 parts per million or 10 parts per million. Some of those types of issues in relationship to maybe you have to have I've heard one person describe a lease where they had to put down 400 pounds of 624-24 in the lease. That may be an obscure and hopefully on the margin thing, but that's obviously way more than what we need from a crop production standpoint. How much are those issues affecting you in relationship to thinking about some of these practices that we move forward on? The idea of putting cover crops on rented land, the ideal of doing a lot of things on rented land when you've only got a one-year lease becomes somewhat problematic. Do you see that as a issue of a 1 for you or a 10 for you? And I do want to show of hands here. Is that a pretty low issue for you in thinking about making practice changes, a 1? Or is that a 10 for you in working with farm operators? A few more on 10. So, that's an area that we need to work on, and that's always it was always the call that I got in Fulton County was how much should I be getting? And I got from a cash rental agreement standpoint, and I got that from both ends. And it was always, normally it was the landlord that called first, and then the tenant was calling up pretty damn quick after that. In that conversation. So, I guess what I'd like to do is maybe can you help us proactively think about how we can work in that space of landlord-tenant relationships, make it a positive conversation, but help try and provide some materials that you can use to work with your landlords to help them understand either the value of some of the capital improvements that might be needed, or the fact that there's some things that annual practices do for us that require really a long-term lease. So how do we work in that space of landlord-tenant relationships and maybe help you help the landlord understand better what's going on? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I would just say, just from a farming standpoint, that it's almost impossible to do anything on I feel like it's almost impossible anymore to do anything on like a one-year lease because if the ground needs limed or gypsumed or cover cropped or whatever, you're not going to see a one-year benefit out of that. So I think it's important from FSA perspective and a lot of other people's perspectives, NRCS or whoever's doing these programs, to encourage the landlords to do like at least a 5-year lease. I feel like just because of the amount of equity we have to put out to try to get anything done.
And the thing with the landlord is going to be what? What's the catch point for the landlord? How much is the check going to be at the end of the year? So maybe thinking about how we do equitable leases. Some more thoughts there on what works from the standpoint of implementing that mechanism to put the price on what the value of that lease is, so that everybody has a comfort level. Might help drive that willingness to be more in those long-term leases is a catch point that I see that maybe we need to work on. Other thoughts?
or an example of how that conversation could go with a landowner?
Like even signing up for like H2 Ohio, so there's stuff you can't sign up for like 1 year thing, if you don't know going into it, you're gonna have county you might rent next year or the following year, you can't bring more acres into said program.
Sure.
Yeah, and the same would be for an NRCS program where typically we're talking about a 3-year time span. So all of those have that problem to it. And like I said, if we can help you, what's the type of conversation that you have with your landlords, and how can we help provide information for you to help in that conversation, I think is the question that I have for you. And if you got an answer today, great. If you don't, labarge.1@osu.edu, always email or whatever. We're happy to take those comments all along, work with Peggy maybe on some materials along those lines. And I think there is some efforts that will happen in relationship to that. Yeah.
Would there be a way that that's calculated in their CAUV to give them credit for future, like a 5% kickback? So many times, the landowners don't get anything. If we can start, if the records are going to be in somebody's office, if they can then be certified to the county auditor to be a rollback, wouldn't that be a nice way to do it, so then it goes right to the property owner, then he feels like he's getting something?
Yeah, there's, thinking about tax. I mean, that's certainly an area. Taxes paid is certainly an area of, trying to leverage some of that conversation. And then I know from the tenant-landlord relationship, it's always, so you're going to participate in this program that's going to pay you $30 an acre, so I guess I'm getting $15 of that, right? I mean, that I'm going to increase land rent. There's those two conversations that I don't have much experience in, that if you can help us understand how those go and what the questions are that you get, I think we can provide some materials that would be helpful.
On the berms along ditches, we don't get very good success anymore because of the regulations that the one gentleman said the federal government puts on. So we are working with our county auditor to get those off the taxes and saying, all right, guys, we'll seed it, but you maintain it. Seems to be being more accepted by, I work with farmers in Lucas County who are pretty obstinate to that type of federal oversight. And that's why I'm thinking that way. If we can get county auditors more involved and get our state politicians to get ways that they could be credited to the landowners, let's try to do that way.
Yeah, and DJ, just to pick up on that point, I think, the conversations need to expand, and we need to think creatively on all of these things, because, H2 Ohio, $30 million sounds like a lot, but it doesn't solve the problem. I'll be here to tell you that. So, thinking about how we can work with tax incentives. I think also some conversations with the county engineer and how we do road design and where water moves and how quick it moves, and some of those types of things are part of the solution to the problem that we're experiencing up in the Western Lake Erie Basin in particular. So, that's why it is so important for us as agricultural people to be involved in those local conversations and even start those local conversations about what the solution is, because I don't have all the answers, and Kevin King's going to be up here later, and he'll tell you he doesn't have all the answers. There's none of us as single individuals out there that have all the answers, but as a collective group, I've been on your farms. I've seen how you've welded things together to make them work better. I've seen how you've, created equipment. I've seen how you've, changed practices and timings and those kind of things, and been very innovative. And we need your innovative thoughts on this issue as much as we do the things that you do in your operations. So be a part of that local conversation. Other questions, comments? Yes, go ahead. Bruce is getting his steps in this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. The H2 Ohio you talked about in Maumee River watershed, and you mentioned $30 million. Is that going to cover every grower in that watershed? Is it going to be first come, first serve? How is that program going to be facilitated?
Well, you know what? About 11:30, we have someone coming in to talk about H2 Ohio, and I don't know the answers to that. Jocelyn might. You want? Well, why don't you talk about it? Just answering that question for sure.
So right now they're doing the first round of funding that'll end here in the end of March for the Maumee Basin, and that funding is first come, first serve. And it's not made to fit every operation. The idea is to have change to your operation, because obviously what we're doing right now isn't working enough to keep the algae out of Lake Erie. So the idea is to make some changes to your operation, and this is to incentivize those changes. Does that answer your question?
So at $30 million, is that enough to cover 50% of the growers? Do you have any idea on?
No. I mean, it would be hard to say. If everybody signs up for the 4 years, that's all going to come out of that 30 million or 33 million. So it just depends on how many acres people sign up and for how. I mean, you can stack some of the practices, and we'll hear more about it later on this morning. But if they stack practices, obviously the funding will go a little quicker on those acres than if they just choose to do an individual practice.
Thank you.
And I think you can do a little math in your head. $33 million, 14 counties, $30 an acre. You know, what kind of coverage are you getting? Can be a pretty simple, in your mind, positioning of where that is. And I haven't done the math, so I don't know the answer to that. And the way I do math, you might not want to rely on my answer anyway. Go ahead.
This might sound a little awkward, but a few minutes ago talking about taxes. I'm currently running a petition around for a new contract ditch for soil and water. This discussion happened 40 years ago with my father and all the members of the neighborhood, and basically when it came down to, well, gee, on property taxes would be the maintenance of that ditch, about 90% of everybody said no, and it didn't get done. I was part of one of those meetings as a young school teacher back in my local community, and the one older fellow who was part of that initial conversation, he and a neighbor are giving me the same sourpuss routine. We're taking a voluntary program within soil and water where we would have the option of paying for the digging now. The individual 2 property owners that have the ditch pay for the brush removal. Everybody would get on board to pay their share of the digging. There's 17 property owners involved. And virtually 100% of the acreage, including these 2 sourpuss guys in the end, and they're both farmers, by the way. This isn't landowners from afar. They represent about 25% of the acreage. I've got the other 75% already signed up. And these 2 guys will gladly pay their share of that digging, but you put this maintenance on my property taxes, forget the whole deal. Still, how do I respond to them?
I would.
And they're farmers, guys. They're us.
You got an answer to the question? Or you got another question?
I guess my thing is what I've seen from us going forward is we've always had county assessments for ditches, and then they never, ever get cleaned. And so the people that we see, we would just rather just pay the bill, foot the bill, and see it done on an as-needed basis, and then we guarantee that our tax money isn't wasted elsewhere.
Okay. Two sides.
A real good record on maintenance, so that hasn't been the same issue. And yeah, these guys, they're quite all willing to pay for the digging, but don't expect me to encumber anything beyond what we do this summer.
Well, always several ways to skin a cat, and yeah. Go ahead, DJ.
Aren't there private and public projects in that as well? That a private project versus that would just be one and done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation where if the ditch is under county maintenance, the county has the authority, whoever the lead authority is, to do the work. If the people opt to do their own work, they can do their own thing. It can never be taken off of maintenance, but it doesn't mean the county engineer has to act. In his situation there, if they're in the lower end, I'd put everything on the maintenance above them and just give them all the water and then see what they'll change.
Oh, I got one more comment on that.
Wait till he's done.
The other thing is, your private contractors work cheaper than our county, and our county likes to exorbitantly charge for their services compared to what you can go on the free market and get done.
Yeah, I had a similar situation. We had a project that we wanted done, and I went to all the people affected and said, you know, this is what it's going to cost. Are you willing to pay? And everybody was on board. I had no problem with that. I actually had more problems with the county engineer and the ditch maintenance people because they couldn't understand why we were going to do this on our own. My answer to them was, and the funny thing is, they were all currently working on another project very close to me and trying to petition it. And I told the county engineer and the ditch maintenance that it would, look, in 6 months, I have this done, it's funded, the contractor's ready to start. We're done. 6 months. It took them 10 years to get the other project through.
We're all fine up to that point. I mean, everybody, including these two guys, getting it digging, getting it done, we'll pay for it, they'll open their checkbooks and it'll be finished. But what was presented to us was that the maintenance had to go on tax.
Right, and after we did our project, we then petitioned to have it put on maintenance, and it was accepted and done. But I'm with you. We've had a couple minor issues, and we've just gotten the landowners together, went in and fixed it ourselves. It got done faster, cheaper, and we know it was done right because we've had issues there before too. And so
we've had good luck with maintenance, so that wasn't really part of my perception being the problem. And of course, to the one fellow who was on my case immediately, I said, well, you know, if we'd have put this on maintenance, if you guys, because I wasn't really involved, had put this on maintenance 40 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
that's correct.
But that's where the stumbling block is. It's not.
Maybe dip that ditch 14 times between now and then, put it on maintenance. Private enterprise is always cheaper than public.
Oh, I don't question you on that.
Sounds like Peggy needs to know, and I think she already does, that we need some work done in drainage laws and drainage drainage issues here in the state of Ohio, which is still an issue. But in you know what we're going to talk about later from a water quality standpoint, let me throw something at you in relationship to that ideal of maintaining our drainage system, and that is you know, can we get somewhere by not having that drainage system be totally clean and designed to within 5 hours have, which it doesn't, but 5 hours have that area drained out versus maybe having some pools and other things in that can provide some retention time within that watershed to think about these water quality issues and what does that take. So I think in addition to drainage laws, it's also how we use drainage and how we meet the goals of both production agriculture and what we need from a environmental standpoint is going to be a challenge for us in the future.
And maybe there's some creative funding that could go along with that, the public good that goes along with the water quality.
Yeah, I mean,
those kind of designs.
When you look at ag census data, you got asked a question in 2007 and 2012, how much tile drainage you have on your farm, and that added up into Henry County to 90%, and you know, there's some pretty big numbers up in Northwest Ohio as far as percentages of the county that have tile drainage to it, which is a darn good investment. And we fought some battles about some people that wanted to do moratoriums on tile about 10 years ago in the basin, and that was a practice that we just couldn't see happening because it means so much from a production standpoint that we have to have drainage. We've got to get those fields drained and water away from it. So it is maybe a compromise at some point that we're going to have to do in relationship to ditch design and what we do at the end of field time.
Just one final comment. All of this only relates to the 3,000 feet of ditch at the end of this thing. The rest of this project, the concession that it's never going to be a group project is long ago made. Everybody upstream of that piece of ditch is already stuck with their own. It's understood that the only thing this is about is that last 3,000 feet of ditch. So we've already conceded the notion of any project that encompasses the whole watershed. That's long gone.
Yeah.
And I never promoted it because I knew it would never work.
Yeah, appreciate those comments and the back and forth. It was really good for me to hear. Any other comments or questions, thoughts?
Again, Greg and I are not Peggy Hall. We're not.
And I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn last
I
night,
know.
so I don't even have that law degree for this morning.
Well, I think what we'll do is we will, if nothing else, we'll allow you to make your room selections. We have about 15 minutes before 9 o'clock here. Greg?
And remember, if you go into another session, do not sign in for CCA credits if it started before 9 o'clock, because CCA credit, we don't want you to get in trouble overlapping those. Great. Well, we'll be back here in about 15 minutes and start the next session.
Final thing here, I guess we always look at relationships, and we're never better than the strength of our relationships. Everybody here has a family doctor. Everybody here has a tax accountant or at least a tax preparer. You really need to have a relationship with an ag attorney. I know a lot of farms have one 10 miles away and some are 100 miles away. But that's very, very important because you never really know when you really need one, and you need to have that relationship. So if you don't have that already, that's something that you really ought to do. If you take nothing more from this session, that would be a good thing.